Welcome to Ground Rules, Employment Law over your coffee break. My name's Pam Howland. I'm here today with Jennifer Walrath and Doug Plass, and we're trying something new in 2026. This is our first episode that is our book club. We're actually going to take a chapter out of the book that we published in 2025, and we're going to do a little deep dive on that chapter. So if you've already bought our Law for Leaders book, it might be a good time to open it up and take a look at chapter 1, which is why supervisors need more training and what that training looks like. So before we jump in, I wanted to tell you a little bit about the book. It's called Law for Leaders, the Roadmap Every Leader Needs to Know to Avoid Workplace Claims and Lawsuits. That was authored by the attorneys at Idaho Employment Lawyers. And we really did that book out of a genuine interest in helping employers to avoid claims and lawsuits. If you've read the book and if you've read some of the introductory chapters, you'll see that what we know by nature of the fact that we're litigators and we defend claims and lawsuits is just how miserable it is for employers when they get pulled into a claim or a lawsuit. Not only is it expensive, time-consuming, stressful, but it's really hard to make a lawsuit go away once it is in the judicial system. That's the way our system is created, is this right to a jury trial. And that means that if you get a lawsuit filed against you, it's probably going to have to go through a number of months, a number of phases, and you're going to have to get quite a ways down the road before you're teed up to go to the court and tell the court why that lawsuit should be dismissed. That's frustrating for employers. Sometimes we have employers who have lawsuits brought and they're like, okay, we need you to take care of this, make it go away. And when we can't do that quickly, through no fault of our own, but through all these factors related to our judicial system, it can be very frustrating for employers. So what we really want and why we wrote the book is to share some basic fundamental employment law concepts for employers, for leaders, so they don't get pulled into a claim or a lawsuit. So that's the purpose behind the book. About a year ago, we had our book launch, and the response to the book has been pretty amazing. I think people are excited about it. We love that it's a great resource for employers to keep handy. So if you have, for example, an ADA issue, you've got a resource you can open and have a fairly short amount of reading that gives you an idea of what you need to do. So what we want to do is talk about chapter 1, which is supervisor training. Why do supervisors need training, and what should that training look like? So let's do a little bit of a, deep dive into that issue, and I'm going to start with Doug. Doug, what do you think about supervisor training? Kind of tell us the first things that come to your mind when you're thinking about why supervisors need training and what that should look like.
Well, there's one real obvious answer to that. So basically, the supervisor's conduct gets imputed to the employer, right? So if you have just a coworker that's doing something discriminatory, the business can, or the entity can deal with it without kind of raising the presumption that it was the business itself that did the conduct. But for a supervisor, the supervisor is in charge of enforcing the policies of the employer. So when the supervisor does something under the law, what the law says is that action was the entity's action itself. So if you have rogue supervisors out there just doing things without understanding what the policies are, without understanding what the law is, you can get yourself in trouble and you really may not be able to get out of it. You might just have to, pay a bunch of money and settle the case because you don't really have a defense.
Yeah. I love that. Yeah, the whole concept of supervisors being held to a higher standard under the law is a real thing. So your supervisors need to have a little more info and a little more knowledge than the regular workforce does.
Well, I was thinking piggybacking on what Doug was saying, there are a lot of decisions that supervisors make day in and day out that they're authorized to make that, over time could be the very things that are the basis of a claim. And I think for a lot of supervisors, it might even be things that they don't think a lot about as they're doing it, like approving PTO requests or not, right? Do you have a good reason for why you said yes to this person and no to that person? Um, Maybe even things like, hey, I'm going to do this task today. And the supervisor says, no, 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 that's not part of your job. Go over here and do this. There just could be very much day-to-day activities and things that a supervisor is deciding, again, well within what they're supposed to be doing, that, the person who is the employee they're supervising might one day bring a claim based on those very decisions. So, that is partly too why for supervisors, they have to understand, could there be long-term consequences for this decision? Is this something I need to document? How do I need to document it? Because they might be the only person making that decision, the only person with knowledge of that decision, and the only one who can really help protect the employer against a possible future claim as part of their role as supervisor.
Yeah. Yeah, I think kind of piggybacking on all that too is the fact that a lot of supervisors got the role they're in by being a really high performer, by maybe being an industry expert. But the reality is, a lot of supervisors go into that position without any experience on how to manage people or on basic compliance issues. So that is a tall ask to get up to speed on the world of people management. And there's a lot of different concepts related to that. Obviously, today we're just talking about the compliance side, but we recognize there's a whole other side of management skills and concepts that supervisors need to know. So, yeah, I love that. Those are great reasons why supervisors need training. Another one that right before we got on the air here, we were thinking about how just in the last year, really since even the book was published, how the law has shifted and changed. And so when we're talking about what types of issues supervisors need to be trained on, we're thinking about what's going on in the world right now. So, Jennifer, what do you think? Like, what are some of the newer issues or the key issues that you think supervisors right now need compliance training on?
I think our list was getting quite long. We
It
were starting to
was.
write them down, I think we will have just done a podcast on this, but one of the biggest, I would say, evolutions in the law that's been happening, right, is this idea of quote unquote reverse discrimination claims maybe not really being quite so much reverse anymore, right? That everyone potentially has a claim, even white American men, right? And I do think that there's a good chance for some supervisors, even if you did have training, 5 years ago, even 2 years ago, even last year, you might not be up on the latest and greatest, essentially, on the law. And it is really important to understand that, the world of people who might be able to bring claims is perhaps broader than you may have thought a couple of years ago, is one thing. So kind of addressing potentially outdated assumptions, perhaps, about, who's in a protected class, who isn't, and just making sure your supervisors know what the latest and greatest is on that issue. Another one we were talking about before we got on the air here was, which I think relates to it in some ways, it's this idea of, social media. It's so much more prevalent than it used to be. To what extent do you as a supervisor, should you or must you do anything to address your employees' off-duty conduct on social media? And it might be an issue of potential harassment. Under Title VII, it might be that you just have employees coming to you and raising complaints because they don't like what someone posted. And, what do you do when those situations come up? Because they're typically not easy answers to those kinds of questions. So just being aware that that is an issue, and you may need to get some help to work through it. Things like that are what, we think it's important for supervisors to know. And I can maybe pass it over to let others, throw a couple more newer, I would say, evolving, emerging issues onto the pile.
Yeah, I mean, I hesitate to say AI is one issue because I think it's 1,000, but kind of just how artificial intelligence is coming into the workplace and what are you going to do about it? Like what do the supervisors know about what the employees are doing, how they're using these tools? How are, does the employer have policies about this and how are those being implemented? I think that's more and more a big deal. That was one. Gosh, what were the other ones?
I'll jump in. Like Jennifer was talking about outdated assumptions and how maybe if, you could have been a supervisor 10 years ago, 15 years ago, and have really been on top of the Americans with Disabilities Act, for example. But the reality is that act got overhauled in the 2009 time period, and really everything changed under it. So, what we were seeing there for a while is supervisors saying, well, I know the ADA and I know what's required, but they hadn't taken into account the fact that that act was completely overhauled and it looks a lot different now. It's much broader. It requires different things from employers. So that's one example of why training, it's not a one and done. It kind of has to be almost annual to keep your supervisors up to speed on what's going on. But the ADA, another example of things that have changed and shifted over time. And that still remains the number one claim against employers, because if your supervisors can't spot the issues in time to bring HR in or maybe legal counsel in, that can create a lot of problems. So, we have seen an uptick in Idaho Human Rights Commission complaints so far this year, and some of those do involve the ADA, and we're seeing more claims on things like ADHD, mental health. I mean, those are a few examples of areas where supervisors might not know and understand that those can be protected, those can be disabilities under the ADA. So that's another example of an area where your supervisors need to get training.
And related to that, now we have the Pregnant Workers Fairness Act, which has extended protections, I would say, to pregnant workers, both prior to, during, and even after pregnancy and childbirth, as currently written and enforced. It is very, very broad, and for some supervisors, a lot of if you're familiar with the ADA, there are a lot of things about the PWFA that will seem familiar, but there also are some very notable ways that the PWFA is different from the ADA. So you also couldn't just, operate under the assumption that it's just another ADA accommodation request and we treat it the same way as we do under the ADA. And, this certainly is not going to be a podcast about the PWFA. But again, you don't want supervisors assuming that they know and understand something when the now new reality is a little different. It is important to understand, for example, there are certain accommodations that essentially must be given under the PWFA. It really is designed to, require less exchange of medical information for most situations, I would say, that arise under the PWFA. And even just knowing that it's out there, it exists, and that it does impose additional requirements on employers is important.
Yeah, I think, we're now in, I guess, the third year that the PWFA has existed. And we still have situations where we're talking to business owners and supervisors and they don't even know that thing exists. So just awareness is a good place to start.
Yeah, we're seeing on some levels, maybe employers that aren't aware of it. And then on other levels, we're seeing other more sophisticated employers who maybe have very skilled HR, seeing fact patterns now that maybe involve things like the ADA, the FMLA, and the PWFA all at once, creating a lot of confusion and questions like, how on earth do we, handle all three of these? Now, normally your supervisors probably aren't going to be the ones that have to figure out those complex issues like that, but, they certainly need to know to flag issues to get them to HR so HR can help maneuver through that. I was going to add another one to the list, which would be religious accommodations. We've seen some relatively recent case law from the U.S. Supreme Court, the Groff v. DeJoy case, really expanding on an employee's right to obtain religious accommodations. That's definitely maybe a bit of an oversimplification in describing that, but at the end of the day, the law has changed on when an employer needs to grant a religious accommodation to some extent, and supervisors at least need to know the whole concept of how broad religious accommodations can be and know how to spot those issues so they can pass them on to HR too.
I would agree. And, shifting a little bit from just, the value of having your supervisors trained on evolving, emerging issues so that, they can flag them for HR and, to the extent they're making decisions on their own, handle them appropriately. We were talking too about, uniformity among how supervisors approach application of company policies and the law. And also, the challenge of a new supervisor, which Pam already alluded to. If you come in addition to perhaps not being familiar with all of the things that we're talking about here today, maybe not being as familiar with policies as you're going to have to be as a supervisor, a new supervisor coming in also maybe needs to get or obtain the institutional knowledge about how a particular department was run in the past to understand, what are the employees used to? How have certain policies been applied in my department? How does it get applied across all departments? So that really is a very valuable thing too, if you're an organization, to have your supervisors across different departments or divisions come together in one place so everyone can have the same understanding as to, how does the organization approach this? What is our standard for granting or denying PTO leave? Do we have a guideline that we can use so that we can do our best to, uniformly apply that when we're making those decisions, on a day-to-day basis in the field, so to speak?
Yeah. And, even just getting people, there's value to getting your supervisors in the same room just to talk about those issues because they may not have even really been on their radar at all, but having everybody together so they can kind of, work through some of the issues that come up, there can be a lot of value to that. So we could sit here all day probably and talk about our views on supervisor training, what should be included. I will say, we've got other chapters coming up that we'll talk about, like documentation, like when to document, how to document, that we'll dive deeper. But in addition to the legal trends and updates, there's a whole lot of fundamental documentation type things that supervisors should get trained on as well as your policies in your handbook, since the supervisors are the ones who are going to need to enforce that. So stay tuned for next time on Law for Leaders and our continuing discussion on a different chapter of our Law for Leaders book. Again, we have some training coming up on the PWFA, for example. We have our triple threat seminar coming up in March, and you can check that out on our website. We've got our training calendar posted. And otherwise, that's it for today. So we'll see you next time on Ground Rules.
Ground Rules hosts and guests are not providing legal advice in this podcast. do not act upon any of the information discussed in this podcast without first consulting a licensed attorney in your jurisdiction.